It started like any other quiet morning in the small town of Millstone. Kids trailing into school half asleep, teachers greeting them with tired smiles, and the janitor whistling some old tune while sweeping up autumn leaves that crept in through the front doors. But deep inside Millstone Elementary, something was brewing that not even the principal could predict. It wasn't in the curriculum. It wasn't on the calendar. And it sure wasn't welcome. This story isn't about textbooks or tests. It's about silence, forced silence, and what happens when someone brave enough decides not to stay quiet. Her name was Ellie Ramirez. She was only 12, but anyone who talked to her for more than a minute would say she was wise beyond her years. Bright, curious, always scribbling things in a little blue notebook she kept tucked under her hoodie. Ellie wasn't the kind of girl who made noise just to be heard. But when she did speak up, it was usually for something that mattered. So when she raised her hand one Monday morning to ask a simple question, something about why the school's history textbooks skipped certain parts of local events, the room went still. Her teacher, Mrs. Kent, paused mid-sentence. She glanced at the classroom door, then back at Ellie. "That's not really in our scope today," she said quickly. "Let's move on." But Ellie didn't move on. That night, she went home and wrote down every detail in her notebook. She started asking more questions, talking to older folks in town. Even the quiet ones started sharing stories, things that had happened, things that had been buried, and things people were too afraid to bring up again. A few days later, Ellie decided to do something bold. She signed up to speak at the school assembly. Just a 5-minute student reflection. She planned to talk about truth, about community, about voices that had been ignored. She wasn't naming names or pointing fingers, just speaking her truth. But the day before the assembly, she was called into the office. The principal's tone was polite, but his message was clear. Her speech was being pulled. "Too sensitive," he said. "Not appropriate for the school setting." When Ellie asked what part was inappropriate, he didn't answer. He just smiled stiffly and told her she should focus on school spirit or upcoming field trips if she still wanted to speak. Ellie went home in tears. She almost gave up. Almost. The next morning, her notebook was missing. Gone from her backpack. No one admitted to taking it, but Ellie knew it wasn't lost. Someone didn't want her story told. She could feel it in the way teachers avoided eye contact, how her classmates whispered in the hallway, how even the librarian, a kind old man who used to let her stay late and read, suddenly seemed distant. But then something unexpected happened. Late Wednesday afternoon, just as the final bell rang and kids started pouring out of the building, a convoy of SUVs rolled into the school parking lot. Big, black, window-tinted. Quiet engines, but heavy presence. They didn't belong to anyone from the PTA or the school board. These weren't school parents with soccer gear in the trunk. They stepped out slowly, one by one, veterans, dressed in plain clothes but carrying a certain kind of posture you don't forget. Men and women, young and old, some with walking canes, others with military tattoos visible under their sleeves. And in the center of them, walking with calm purpose, was Ellie's grandfather. Most people in town didn't even know he was a vet. He kept to himself, fixed cars in his garage, waved at neighbors but didn't talk much. But Ellie had always listened to his stories, the real stories he only told when it was just the two of them. Stories about honor, about promises, about what silence can cost. No one at the school knew what to do. The principal came rushing out, clipboard in hand, asking if there was a problem. Ellie's grandfather didn't raise his voice. He just said, "We came to listen." The other veterans nodded. That's all they said. "We came to listen." Word spread fast. Parents started showing up. Some confused. Some concerned. Others just curious. And while no one had raised a single voice, the message was deafening. Ellie stood near the front doors, her face pale but steady. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't alone. The school board called an emergency meeting. The district issued a vague statement about student expression and balancing sensitivities. But none of that could erase the image of those SUVs pulling up, or the way Ellie's voice seemed to rise even in silence. She never got her notebook back. But she didn't need it anymore. Her story had already begun. And just when it seemed like things were settling, that maybe the veterans had made their point and the school would quietly move on, a phone call came in late that night. It was a voice Ellie hadn't heard in years. A woman, out of breath, with a warning. "They're not done yet. And this time, they're coming for more than your words." Who was she? What did she mean? And why did Ellie's grandfather suddenly pack a bag and tell her not to go to school the next day? The answers were coming. But not the ones anyone expected. Stay with us. Because what happened next shook more than just one town. It rattled something bigger. And Ellie's story, this story, is just getting started. Ellie couldn't sleep that night. The woman's voice still echoed in her mind, raspy, anxious, full of something deeper than fear. It felt like a warning, but also like a secret trying to surface. Her grandfather didn't say much after he hung up the phone. He just started moving with quiet urgency, packing an old duffel bag from the closet in the hallway. Ellie watched him carefully lay folded clothes next to a small metal box, the kind with a lock on it. She'd never seen it before. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. He looked at her, his eyes tired but sharp. "Nowhere yet. Just be ready, Mija. Things are moving faster than I thought." Outside, the wind was picking up. Leaves scraped across the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went silent. Millstone always had this eerie stillness at night, like the whole town was holding its breath. But tonight felt different, like the town knew something was coming and was too afraid to speak. At school the next day, everything looked normal on the surface. The bell rang, lockers slammed, and the announcements crackled through the PA system like usual. But the atmosphere had changed. There were two unfamiliar men standing by the front office, clean-cut, no badges, just watching. The secretary smiled too brightly. The teachers stuck to the script. And no one mentioned the veterans. Not once. Ellie kept her head down and tried to act normal, but her mind was racing. Who was that woman on the phone? Why was her grandfather acting like he was preparing for something big? And what did it all have to do with her wanting to speak up? During lunch, Ellie slipped away from the cafeteria and walked to the edge of the school grounds, where the old library used to be before it was closed off years ago. There, behind the locked gate and rusted sign, stood the boarded-up structure no one talked about. Her grandfather once told her stories about it, how it used to be a community hub, how it was suddenly shut down after some incident no one wanted to explain. She stared at it, feeling something heavy in her chest. A teacher spotted her and waved her back inside, but Ellie took one last look before heading in. Something about that place was connected to all of this. She could feel it. Back home that evening, her grandfather handed her a small, folded paper. It was an old article, yellowed with time, dated almost 20 years back. The headline read, "Millstone veteran found dead after public dispute with school board." Ellie read the first few lines and froze. The man's name was Mateo Rivera, her grandfather's best friend. "They said it was suicide," he said quietly. "But we never believed that." Ellie looked up at him, heart pounding. "Why?" "Because the day before it happened," he said, voice low, "Mateo said he found something in that library. Something they didn't want getting out." Ellie's mouth went dry. "What kind of something?" But her grandfather didn't answer. Instead, he turned and looked out the window like he was expecting someone to arrive. And maybe he was, because across the street, parked just out of sight, a dark sedan had been sitting there since noon. Same car. Same spot. Every day. And someone inside was watching. The car was still there the next morning, same dark windows, same stillness. Ellie stood by the living room curtain, just enough space to peek through without being seen. Her grandfather was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a black coffee and the locked metal box beside him. He hadn't said much since the article. He didn't have to. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was close. At school, the atmosphere kept shifting, like everyone was trying to pretend harder. The teachers were rigid, overly cheerful. The principal passed through the hallways more than usual, always with someone new by his side. They looked like consultants, maybe state board members, but Ellie had seen one of them standing near the car outside her house the day before. She felt her stomach twist. They weren't there to help. In class, Ellie caught Samir watching her. He was the only friend she still trusted. He mouthed a question, "You okay?" She nodded, but barely. Later at lunch, he found her in the corner of the library. "I heard my uncle talking to someone last night," he whispered. "They said your name. Said something about shutting things down before the veterans get too involved." Ellie leaned in, heart thudding. "Shutting what down?" "I don't know. But he said they're worried the old files might resurface. Something about what used to be stored in that back room of the library, before they shut it." Ellie remembered the broken lock on that boarded-up building. The way her grandfather had looked at it. The name Mateo Rivera. There was something there, something that tied the school, the silence, and the veterans together. Meanwhile, tension was building outside the school too. Parents were whispering in grocery aisles. Some of the veterans had started holding meetings at the community center. No one said exactly what they were planning, but the feeling was clear: the silence wasn't going to last much longer. One woman, Mrs. Holloway, who used to teach history, was seen crying outside the town hall after speaking with someone from the school board. People said she once taught lessons that were later revised and pulled from the curriculum. Ellie could sense the storm gathering from all directions. She didn't want to be at the center of it, but somehow she was. Her voice had stirred something buried deep beneath the school's polished image. And now, it was as if the town itself was waking up, remembering things it had tried to forget. Back at home that night, her grandfather finally opened the locked metal box. Inside were old cassette tapes, faded photos, and a folded-up blueprint of the school. He laid it out on the table and pointed to a shaded room marked Record Sublevel B. "That room," he said, "was never supposed to exist. But Mateo found it. And after that, everything changed." Ellie stared at the map, her heart racing. Sublevel B wasn't listed on any modern school plans. No one ever talked about it. But if it was still there, it might hold the answers everyone was too afraid to say out loud. And outside, the car was gone. But someone had left a note wedged in their mailbox. It only had 5 words. "Stop digging, or she disappears." The note shook Ellie more than she expected. It wasn't just a threat, it was how calm the handwriting looked. Neat. Clean. Like whoever wrote it wasn't in a hurry, like they'd done this before. Her grandfather stared at it for a long time, then folded it once and tucked it into his jacket pocket without a word. That silence said everything. He wasn't surprised. The next morning, Ellie didn't go to school. Her grandfather said she was sick and called it in. But the truth was, they were preparing. That night, under a heavy blanket of fog, they met Samir near the old library. He had brought his cousin, Noor, whose dad worked in construction. She had access to tools, and more importantly, courage. They wore gloves, carried flashlights wrapped in cloth to dim the beams, and slipped through the side fence where the gate had rusted through. The building smelled like dust and rotting paper. Everything was still. But when Noor pried open the back panel behind the old circulation desk, Ellie saw it, the outline of a staircase hidden behind plywood, half covered in insulation. No one had touched it in years. Her heart raced as they stepped into the darkness. The air grew colder the farther they went. The stairs creaked like they might collapse, but they held. At the bottom, they found a steel door with faded words etched into it: "Records, be level." It was real. Inside, the room was larger than they expected. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, most of them rusted shut. But a few opened with a fight, revealing dusty folders, handwritten logs, and names, so many names. Students. Teachers. Dates going back decades. Some files were marked with red tags. Others were marked closed indefinitely. Ellie reached for a box labeled Disciplinary Archives 2006, and froze when she saw the first file, Mateo Rivera. There were notes, scribbled in the margins. Warnings. Reports from staff that didn't match what her grandfather had told her. Pages were missing. Some were burned at the edges, like someone tried to destroy them but didn't finish the job. Then they heard it. A creak upstairs. Slow. Deliberate. Someone else was in the building. Her grandfather turned off his flashlight instantly. They all stayed still, barely breathing. More footsteps. This time closer. Not rushed, measured, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Samir whispered. They followed us. Her grandfather reached into his coat and pulled out a tiny voice recorder. We have enough, he said quietly. We go now. But just as they turned to leave, another sound echoed through the stairwell, a voice. Calm, steady, familiar. I told you to stop digging. It was the man from the front office. The one Ellie had seen with the principal. Only now, his voice carried something else behind it, not authority. Control. Ellie's flashlight flickered. They were trapped below ground, holding documents people had tried to erase. And above them, someone had just locked the door. The sound of the lock clicking shut echoed through the stairwell like a final decision. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. They were underground. Trapped. And the man upstairs, the one who had calmly warned her to stop, was no longer warning. He was acting. Her grandfather stepped forward, pressed his ear to the door, and whispered, We don't have time. His voice was tight, controlled, but Ellie could hear the urgency creeping in. Noor tried the handle again. Nothing. Not even a rattle. Whoever locked it knew exactly how to seal it from the outside. Samir started pacing in tight circles. There has to be another way out, he said, his voice cracking slightly. You don't build something like this without a second exit, right? Noor grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room, landing on a rusted vent cover low on the far wall. She moved toward it without hesitation. Help me, she said. As they pried it loose, Ellie flipped through more of the files, desperate for something, anything, that made this worth the risk. That's when she found the second twist buried in a brown folder with no label. Inside were photographs, grainy black and whites of students, some circled in red ink. Pages of typed evaluations. One file in particular stopped her cold. It had her name on it. Ellie Ramirez. Student file. Confidential. She froze. The folder wasn't a school record, it was a surveillance file. Notes from meetings she didn't remember attending. Observations about who she talked to, what she said in class, even what she wrote in her notebook. The pages were stamped with the name of a private contractor, one she'd never heard of, but at the bottom, in faint ink, was something else. Asset status unstable. Monitor daily. Ellie stared at the words, her mind racing. She wasn't just being silenced. She was being tracked. Before she could process it, Noor called out. She'd made it halfway into the air duct. Samir helped Ellie climb in next. Her grandfather stayed behind just long enough to grab the box of records they'd found and tuck the recorder into his coat. The duct was tight, hot, and covered in dust. They crawled in silence, breathing through their shirts, the sound of footsteps still echoing behind them from above. But halfway through the crawl, the air shifted. Something wasn't right. The vent ahead was lit with a strange glow. Ellie pushed forward and peeked out through the grate. What she saw stopped her heart. They weren't in the library anymore. The duct had led to a hidden wing, long-abandoned classrooms filled with storage crates and tech equipment, covered in tarps. And in the middle of the room, under fluorescent lights, stood the principal. He was talking to someone on a video call. Ellie strained to listen. We've contained the files, he said. But one of the students, she's listed under the old program. Ramirez. We didn't realize her connection to Rivera until too late. There was a pause. Then a cold voice replied through the speaker. Then fix it. Before this turns federal. Ellie's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a school cover-up. It was bigger. and she was right in the center of it. Ellie didn't wait. She kicked the grate open and dropped into the hidden classroom, heart pounding. Samir and Noor followed, barely hitting the floor before her grandfather slid down behind them, clutching the metal box tight to his chest. The principal spun around, shocked, but not surprised. His hand moved toward the desk drawer. "Don't," Ellie's grandfather warned, voice steady. "You don't want to make this worse." From the speaker, the cold voice crackled again. "Who else is with them?" The principal didn't answer. Ellie stepped forward, holding up the surveillance file with her name on it. "This is what you were doing? Monitoring students? Hiding files? Threatening veterans?" Her voice rose with each word. "Why?" The principal hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. It was meant to protect the school, protect the program." "What program?" Noor asked sharply. He didn't get to answer. Because that's when the doors burst open. Veterans, at least a dozen, stormed in. Uniforms faded but still proud, faces sharp with purpose. Leading them was a tall man with a limp and a fierce glare. Mateo Rivera's brother. "We have the recordings," one of them said. "We know what you've been doing with student data. We know about Sublevel B. And now, the state attorney knows too." Ellie's grandfather handed over the recorder without a word. The principal stepped back, defeated, and the voice on the screen went silent as the call disconnected. It was over. Almost. As the room filled with tense silence, Ellie opened the last file in the box, an unmarked envelope. Inside was a picture of her mother, younger, standing next to Mateo and her grandfather. She was wearing a student badge from the same school. "Why is she in this?" Ellie asked, confused. Her grandfather looked away, eyes heavy. "Your mother helped Mateo uncover the files years ago. They erased her records to protect her, but she disappeared before we could stop them." Ellie's hands trembled. All this time, she thought it started with her. But it didn't. It started before she was even born. And now, someone else knew she was still alive. The following days were quiet, but not in the way they used to be. This was a different kind of silence, heavy, watchful, but finally honest. Word spread quickly through Millstone. Sublevel B had been exposed. The files, the surveillance, the years of manipulation and fear, it was all coming to light. The veterans, with help from outside legal teams, began releasing statements and forwarding documents to state investigators. The school board tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The community had seen enough. Ellie returned to school, not as the quiet girl who kept her head down, but as someone who had helped break years of silence. Students looked at her differently now, some confused, some curious, but others with quiet respect. Even teachers who once avoided eye contact offered nods in the hallway. Things weren't fixed overnight, but something had shifted. The power that once controlled everything from the shadows was no longer invisible. Her grandfather stayed close by, always watching, always cautious. They still didn't know who else had been part of the program, or who might still be watching, but they had each other. Ellie kept the photo of her mother close. It raised more questions than answers, but for the first time, she felt like she had a place to begin searching. Her mother hadn't just been another student. She had known the truth, had fought for it, and maybe, was still out there. Noor and Samir stuck with Ellie through it all. They helped organize a small gathering outside the library building, no speeches, no protests, just candles and quiet reflection. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with students, parents held their children close, and for a brief moment, Millstone felt like a town coming back to life. As Ellie stood in the soft glow of candlelight, she thought about everything, what they'd found, what they'd risked, and what still waited to be uncovered. She didn't have all the answers. But she had the truth now. And that was more than enough to start with. Before they left that night, a small envelope appeared on the library steps. No one saw who placed it there. Inside, a single note in the same clean handwriting as before. Some voices were never meant to disappear. Ellie read it once, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. This time, she wasn't afraid.